Hello, music fans. Today I'm going to talk about some band recommendations for bands that start with the letter P. My personal favorite is Protest the Hero, and this is their album, their first album, Kazaya. I like all their albums, I own all their albums. I got Palimpsest on vinyl, the rest I have on CD. They are a progressive metal band, and yeah, Kazaya came out in 2005. They've got some metalcore, hardcore, mathcore influences in there, as well as punk rock. So they're kind of punk and hardcore inspired progressive metal. For think like Propagandy, which will maybe be another band I mentioned today, on the punk rock side, kind of mixed with like Periphery and Sixth, but less djent. Protest the Hero doesn't really. They only use six-string guitars. They do very busy guitar work. Usually a lot of like finger tapping, sometimes sweeping and stuff like that. Really cool sounding band. And my second favorite band that starts with P is another progressive metal band, Periphery, and this is their debut album, which is maybe my favorite of theirs. I don't know. All their albums they're pretty consistent. They're all good. Like Protest the Hero, progressive metal, but Periphery uses, unlike Protest the Hero, Periphery uses 7-string and 8-string and low tuning um, guitars, and they kind of do the more djent grooves and polyrhythms and stuff. Protest the Hero does polyrhythms too, but not the djent aesthetic like Periphery. And Periphery really popularized djent. Now for some honorable mentions. Staying on the prog side for a bit, Porcupine Tree is another great progressive rock band. They're not as metal. They have a little bit of metal influence from time to time, and they are a little bit metal inspired, but I wouldn't consider them a metal band. I'd call them more progressive rock. They're also they also have a lot of psychedelic influences, especially on their earlier work. So yeah, pretty cool band. And then another honorable mention, obviously the legendary progressive rock band Pink Floyd. And this is their album. I have this on vinyl here, Wish You Were Here. My favorite album of theirs. But I like a lot of their albums. They have a few misses throughout their discography. They're not all good. Like I wouldn't recommend people start with Gumma because that's throwing them off the deep end. But the stretch of albums from Dark Side of the Moon to The Wall, there's 4 albums there, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall are really legendary. And a lot of their works before that are really good. Metal and Atom Heart Mother, and even their first 2 albums, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn and A Saucer Full of Secrets, are good. Those are completely different though. Those are more psychedelic, whereas their later career or their mid-career was more the progressive rock, and then their later career is not as progressive, it's more just, I don't know, art rock um, after that. But yeah, it's a very good band. And another progressive band that starts with P that's really great is Pain of Salvation. This is their album Panther. They're a progressive metal band from Sweden. Panther's not my favorite album of theirs. It just happens to be the one that I own. I think my favorite would be Remedy Lane from 2002. But they're also quite consistent, and all their albums are good. 2 more bands that start with P on the progressive side. Then this is a busy letter today. There's lots of great bands that start with P. Then I've got some that I'll mention on the alternative, and then the punk side, and then the just classic rock side. So on the prog side, another one is Persephone, I think is how you pronounce it. They're an Andorran progressive death metal band. really good progressive metal with influences from technical death metal and melodic death metal. Yeah, all their albums are good as well. I don't think they're as popular as the bands that I mentioned before in this video, but they are really solid. And then last one I'm going to mention on the prog side is a very old progressive metal band called Psychotic Waltz. And they started under the name of Aslan in 1985, so could be considered among the pioneers of like the founding bands of progressive metal at that point with their work, with their Aslan demo, which came out in 1986. They'd be among those other bands like Queensryche and Fate's Warning that kind of started progressive metal. And it was kind of heavy metal inspired, but then they had their progressive rock influences, so did weird time signature changes and virtuosic guitar playing and stuff like that. Their first studio album came out in 1990. They released 4 albums in the 90s and then went on a hiatus, but they released a new album in 2020 called The God-Shaped Void, which is also really cool. All their albums are good, so I recommend you check out Psychotic Waltz. Now on to the alternative side, I recommend A Perfect Circle, especially if you're a fan of Tool and Maynard James Keenan's vocals, because this is a band that's a supergroup that has Maynard James Keenan on vocals. And I really like their album from 2018 called Eat the Elephant. That's my favorite of theirs, but all of their albums are good as well. Another one on the alternative side, more alternative metal and funk metal, very experimental, a little bit progressive at times, would be Primus. They're a very unique sounding band. Not very many bands sound like them, and I really love the bass playing of Les Claypool, who's also the vocalist and frontman and main songwriter for the band. And all their albums are really, really cool. I don't even know which one I'd recommend to start with. I actually really like their most recent album, The Desaturating 7 from 2017. It's kind of more progressive. They've done a weird cover of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory songs as well as an album, which is kind of weird and hilarious. But their earlier work is more funky and more classic as well. So if you like funk and weird bass lines, I recommend the earlier work, and if you like more experimental psychedelic proggy stuff, I'd recommend their later stuff, but it's all good. And then another one on the alternative rock side is Pusifer, which is another band that has Maynard James Keenan. So he's in Tool, A Perfect Circle, and Pusifer. This one's weird. It's kind of like post-industrial experimental trip hop with electronic and ambient stuff, but also rock inspired. Very bizarre music, but really cool. Now moving on to the punk rock side, my recommendation for a band that starts with P there would be Propagandy. I mentioned them earlier in the videos. They inspired Protest the Hero. They're a great Canadian punk rock band. They have some influences from heavy metal and hardcore as well. I like actually their later work. I think my favorite album of theirs would be Failed States from 2012. And then 2 more mentions for this video. This is a long one today, I know. More on the classic rock side, we've got the band The Police. They're kind of new wavy reggae rock, post-punk and pop rock all mixed together with Sting on bass and vocals. He went on to have a solid solo career as well. But I prefer his work with the band, The Police, over his solo work. And my favorite album of theirs is 1983's Synchronicity. And the last artist I'll mention that starts with P is, of course, Paul McCartney from the Beatles. And he is a great rock artist. He also has some albums that are classical. His solo albums are hit or miss. Some of them are really good and some of them are not so much. Like he has some that are like classical and electronic, and I mean they're not terrible, but they're not what I'm looking for when I listen to Paul McCartney. I prefer his rock stuff over his classical and electronic albums. Yeah, surprisingly, his output in 2018, Egypt Station, he was already fairly old at that point, but that's actually one of my favorites by him, maybe my favorite of his. That's kind of when I started getting into his solo work, so that I might be biased there, but I really like the Egypt Station album. And yeah, he was pretty old when he made it, but he still knows how to rock. And that's it for my band recommendations that start with the letter P. Until next time, we'll talk about the letter Q in the next video. Peace out.